Well, hi, Dayspring. I'm actually recording this multiple times because I haven't quite got it down yet exactly how I want to say this. But first of all, I want to say I hope you've enjoyed the sequence that our brother Mark Ashton has been doing on Revelation. It's been very useful for me. Second, I hope you'll get a chance to jump into some of the city serve opportunities that are coming up in a few weeks. Our journey group has been involved with a few things this summer as we are able, proper distancing and all. The impulse to serve is very much on the tip of our experience right now, and I hope maybe some of you will as well. Third thing, as we get into Romans again, I'd like to say thank you to John. John engaged Romans 13, the discussions of particularly government issues and the posture of the community of faith towards the government and governments as a whole. As many of you know, ours is a country that was fomented in a rebellion to governments and powers and constituted one way or another. And so the issues that we got going are very complicated, but I'm glad John was able to stay to the text, and I hope that that was useful to you. The end of Romans 13 focuses upon one's love for one's neighbor, and that seems to be terribly apropos in our current time. We live in highly polarized times, and while there are things to be angry about, Paul's mindset is always that we bring love and affection as a tempering a tool into virtually all of our conversations with our neighbors and all kinds of reasons. Now that said, Romans 14 and 15 essentially want to fill out the way it is we live with one another with love. And how Christians live together even when we might disagree on many things, because we do disagree on many things. One of the things that I've often suggested that Christians do is to recognize that we live with a pyramid of differences, which is to say that at the very top of things that we have very few things that we're absolutely committed to. We go to the mat. I think as I get older, I think the number of those things declines, even though I know more than I did 40 years ago. I also find that there's a very few things that I'm willing to really go to the mat for. Maybe the song, Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, for the Bible tells me so. I think there are other things. I think some of my Christology, that is my teaching about who Jesus and what he's about, what God is like, a little bit about what humans are like, and the nature of our not only sinfulness, but also our image-bearing character. But then something about salvation. That is, how does a divine being and a human that's flawed and tainted by sin actually get together and have some sense of relationship with another? Those things are very important to me, and I think I would go to the mat for them. But there are subsequently lower issues that I have a lot of study and a lot of time built into studying and working through, but I don't have the same equal level of importance. It's one of the damaging things about having a doctrinal statement. It's designed to protect an institution, but it also puts everything in that statement on an equal level. At Grace, we had an extremely long one, and it suggested that all of those elements, because they're all in black and white on the same page, some of them looked more important than they actually were in fact. There are right things and there are wrong things, and there's plenty of opportunities in between. But it's that reality, like Trinitarianism versus my angelology and my teaching about angels and what they're about, I have to keep a wide variety of things. Now, these things happen in other areas as well. They happen in non-moral areas. How to practice communion, how to practice baptism. I do not consider a Methodist to be a heretic because they baptize children. Any more than I think that communion served once a year or every other week is ultimately it's a variable tradition that is not one of those things I want to put to the very top of my doctrinal list like Trinitarianism. There are moral issues like this that actually carry merit. Those are non-moral. There are moral issues that I have some concerns about. Life and death. I think the Ten Commandments, or at least the latter tablet of them with regard to dealing with one another, I think to some degree the former tablet of dealing with God as well, are in this category of morality. But I also think there are many things within the moral category that in fact are highly idiosyncratic to culture, context, age, generation, and where in the world we actually are. Modesty would be one of those. Entertainment, there's all kinds of things. Music is very much can be a generational thing, although it doesn't have to be. My father was into rock and roll music when I was into rock and roll music, even though he was already in his 50s and 60s. Music can be, but it doesn't have to be. And that's part of the way we live in our culture. Now, Romans 14 and 15 go into what we call gray issues, gray areas. Gray areas are those things that are not black and white. That's quite simply what it is. Black things matter and white things matter, but gray matters are issues that we have to wrestle with. Because for us, sometimes some of those gray matters work, but the other are conscience things, where for others, those gray matters are not so much conscience things. And defining the difference and identifying the difference itself is, first of all, that's not easy, but then what to do with it when we have those differences, that's the problem. In theology, we talk about, we might use the word adiaphora. The adiaphora are those things that, where basically we are ultimately indifferent to them. The Stoics had that language, where morality neither mandates nor forbids certain behavior. That's what the adiaphora were. And for us as Christians, wisdom starts to pop up here a lot, because things that may or may not be adiaphora are very variable, and we have to learn to live with one another in those areas. The real difficulty is to identify what adiaphora are, and then what do we do about them? Let me suggest that in Romans 14 and 15, we get a sense, at least within this community, what was adiaphora. And the way to look at that is, I'm going to cherry pick some passages here and just recite them really quickly, and I think you'll hear them really quickly, what Paul has in mind. In 14:2, one person believes he may eat anything. The other person eats, called the weak person, eats only vegetables. Now, hang on to the word weak, we'll come back to that, but that meat and vegetables are there. 14:5, one person esteems one day as better than another esteems all alike. The one who eats in honor of the Lord. The one who abstains in honor of the Lord. Notice that both of them are doing that. 14:20, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. 21, it's not good to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. Hang on to the stumble issue. 23, whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. Again, the language of doubt and faith are critical. We'll come back to those as well later on. When you hear them, though, what you hear is that Paul is dealing with things like meat and vegetables. You get language of one who abstains or doesn't abstain. You also get words of like day and day of the week in particular cases. Now, let's take those and set them just aside for a minute and go over here for a little bit and look at something else. And I'm going to bring them back together again. When we started the epistle as a whole, one of the things that I suggested we learn how to read the book backwards. Now, that is to say, I can watch or read Lord of the Rings 3 times, so that when I go back now and read the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, I know where the story is going to go. And so when I watch the story, I can begin to see the echoes and anticipations of the other end of the story by what's going on inside. This is what happens when we read Romans. If we know that Paul is going to deal with 14 and 15, it explains a little of why he engages everything that goes on in chapters 1 all the way up through 13. So repeatedly, we hear early on in this book that the audience is made up of both Jew and Gentile. There is a racial and a racial and a religious tint going on in this context, and that shapes what's been going on all along. So in chapter 2, if you call yourself a Jew, rely on the law and boast in God. Or chapter 3, he asks questions, what advantage does a Jew have after all? Or later in chapter 3, if God's the God of the Jews only, or not also, isn't he also the God of the Gentiles? And the answer is yes, he is. And in chapter 4, is this blessing of forgiveness then only for the circumcised or for the uncircumcised? You hear the Jew-Gentile issue. When you get to chapters 9, 10, and 11, it shows up again, particularly because in chapter 9, Paul's going to say, as a Jew, I would willingly give my salvation for those, my brethren, according to the flesh, for the Jews. Or in chapter 10, he's going to discover that there's complete equality of access to God for both Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of both of them. In chapter 11, he actually speaks directly to the Gentile and said, don't get yourself into much of a huff, because quite honestly, if God can cut off the natural branches, he can cut you off as well. And so there's this big picture of God, Paul speaking to both Jew and Gentile, and that has been the case all along. So when we get to chapter 14, we have pretty good ground to believe that when Paul says days and food, or meat and vegetables, he is talking with regard to Jewish concerns about properly sacrificed meat, or even meat sacrificed to idols, and Sabbath versus non-celebration of Sabbath, certain days being elevated. The Gentile wouldn't care on either case. The Jew would care on both cases. And we know that this is true because this has been going to be dogging Paul most of his career. He had heard Jesus' words about the Sabbath being made for man and not the other way around, and and Mark 2, and Mark 7, he knows about the fact that Jesus declared all foods to be clean by what comes out of a man, not what goes into a man. Frankly, Paul had also done the issue of circumcision back in chapter 6 of Galatians, where he says circumcision is actually nothing. And everything in a Jew is scratching his head. That just sounds counter to everything he knows. Sabbath procedures, all this sort of stuff regarding circumcision and food laws. This is very counterintuitive. Paul's point is none of these things give you a religious leg up. So bring it back to Romans 14 and 15 again. He's going to say that there are weak and there are strong. And I want to spend the rest of our time talking briefly about weak and strong, what that means. Next time we'll begin to probe some examples of what gray areas might look like for us. But the weak and the strong. The weak are those who cannot do certain kinds of actions without conscience violations because of their behavior. They can't. And the strong are those who can. So Paul's mindset says that for Torah-obedient Jews, they can't eat meat without violating their conscience if they think the meat might be sacrificed, it's unclean in some sense, or it's to idols or something like that. And Paul knows that these things are nothing ultimately. We see that in Corinthians, and there's a bit of a debate what goes on between Corinthians and Revelation. That's for another discussion. But for the time being, this sets you up. The Jewish community is concerned about these things. The non-Jewish community is not concerned about these things, and you can see this tension that would naturally grow. Let me make 2 points here, and then we're going to quit. Many today believe the strong among us are those who can stay as far away from sin as they possibly can. I don't have any problem with the idea of staying away from sin. I just don't think that's what Paul's getting at here. For Paul, the strong are those whose consciences are not violated by certain behaviors. The weak are those whose consciences are. Sometimes the strong are those whose consciences are really not violated by things that would surprise us. So we get the strong and the weak, and we got to understand that from Paul's point of view, the strong are those who can do things, and the weak are those who can't. It's not the other way around. We've messed that up in a lot of times in our history. Second thing to remember is that Paul's fundamental concern is for the spiritual health of people. In other words, for him, the issue was a concern not to cause a brother or a sister to stumble due to personal practices. So how does that work? We're going to get to more of that in the future, but sometimes it's possible for a strong person who is comfortable with certain behaviors to adopt a weak posture about certain things in order not to offend. I'm concerned, for instance, that sometimes we get professional nerves who are bothered by behavior of other people because they don't like them. And Paul does not like that either. He is concerned about the spiritual health of those, especially those who are young, that might be led into sin. An example of that might be a church that I was at in West Virginia many years ago. The decision to move, it was a small church, a relatively young church, and they were using a little bit of a kind of a diluted wine for communion. And as soon as they had a person come into the community, it was only 35 or 40 of us, who was alcoholic by background, the decision was, well, just go to grape juice because there's no point in causing that guy to stumble. It's not that important to us. And that was a person where we took a posture that was technically weak, even though we were strong about the issue. We just didn't care enough. So I want to sort of keep that going. But there are people who are personally offended who shouldn't be, because they're mature enough not to be offended, but they are offended because they like being offended. And that's where I think that's not what Paul is talking about. Now, examples of strong and weak, they can go on for quite a while. We'll talk about some of those next time. Historically, of course, in our country, the issues of alcohol and entertainment and music, all those things, there's a lot of brouhaha going on in those things. I know at Grace University, the idea of having a drama department troubled many Christians at the other end of the state for a lot of reasons, and music and things like that, and rock and roll music bothered people. We're going to come back to that. I just want to sort of lay the basic groundwork now for these issues, and we can talk about them again. Would you let me pray as I close? Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for Paul. These are some complicated issues, but help us to navigate them well. Help us to live them well. The strong and the weak among us is not essentially an issue of who's more spiritual or not. Would you help us to walk well with one another in a very divided culture, whether it be politics or morality, all kinds of things, when there's genuine disagreement about things that you would consider to be non-binding and non-issues. So help us be wise about those things as we live with one another together in the same community. Thanks, Lord, for the week. Make it good for Jesus' sake. Amen.